Hello everyone, welcome to the internally screening review of The Addiction. This is a Hooptober review. This film satisfies the horror film made in your birth year. We are both born in 1995, and this was a tough one because you can Google it. There were slim pickings for horror films in 1995 apparently. So I went for something a bit more obscure, something a bit more arty to mix the list up. This is directed by Abel Ferrara, who is a sort of art house legend. It stars Lili and Christopher Walken, who is a long-time collaborator of Abel Ferrara. And it's set in New York. It's a vampire black and white film with a very sort of art house aesthetic that takes a sort of alternative look at vampirism as a concept. It's called The Addiction, so the film is very obviously drawing parallels to drug addiction is basically the primary theme of the film. So the film opens, our main character Lili Taylor gets attacked by a vampire and becomes a vampire, and it's kind of a film, it's almost like a weird, depressing, dark coming of age film about becoming a vampire. It's not good vibes, you know. We're not talking Linklater fun times growing up coming of age. We're sort of talking about, oh god, the concept of mortality coming of age. What did you think of The Addiction?
I don't know. It was one of those films I felt it was really hard to get a read on at any point. I couldn't tell if I was kind of enthralled by it in a strange way, because I was like, well, where is this journey taking us? And in a way, it's quite circular. It doesn't really go anywhere. It kind of, much in the way an addiction does, it's a vicious cycle. It feels very much repetitious, but purposefully so. I think the first thing that really caught me off guard and still kind of confuses me is the use of incredibly philosophy-heavy dialogue, because it's set in a college campus with a philosophy student, and it's sort of alongside this blatant drug addiction parallel. It then tries to sort of tie in, I guess, sort of nihilist existential philosophy into the mix as well, with some quite, I guess, high concept but also simultaneously quite pretentious and convoluted dialogue, I would say. And again, I kind of got the impression it was intentional, that this wasn't just a film being pretentious because it thought it was super deep, but that it was almost taking the piss out of its character and the flawed nature of the people and addiction in of itself. But I can't really work out to what purpose. That's a thing that still confuses me.
I'm going to be honest. Is one of my biggest pet peeves in art films ever, is this like just use of really flowery philosophical language. I'm sure it can be well done, but I remember a film I saw ages ago. It was like a almost 5 hour long, I think Indonesian film, I could be wrong, an Asian film called Norte, the End of History, and it was at its core, I think it was like a retelling of Crime and Punishment, and quite an interesting, really great story with great production value, and it was completely ruined by the fact that none of the characters spoke to each other in a way that felt even slightly real. And I know that not every film has to have like realistic dialogue. Like, for example, look at any Stanley Kubrick film. Stanley Kubrick's my favourite director by far, and if you watch 2001: A Space Odyssey, no one in that film interacts in any kind of realistic way. It's all very cold and affected and strange for a purpose. Whereas this film has a lot of characters ranting to each other or just sort of monologuing in a way that kind of feels like the screenwriter, presumably Abel Ferrara, just kind of talking to the audience.
Kierkegaard was right. There is an awful precipice before us. But he was wrong about the leap. There's a difference between jumping and being pushed. You reach a point where you are forced to face your own needs, and the fact you can't terminate the situation settles on you with full force. It's not cogito, ergo sum, but dedita, ergo sum.
Which, again, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but the film doesn't really do it in a very interesting way, and I agree that the dialogue is, and I hate describing films as pretentious, but it is just pretentious to me. I really didn't enjoy that element of it at all, and that's so much of the film, is characters sat in small dark places having nihilistic conversations with each other, punctuated with a bit of violence here and there. But ultimately I really didn't like this film because I didn't think it was very scary.
No.
I didn't think it was very interesting. The best thing I could say about it is that the acting was quite good and that it had a pretty interesting visual presentation and atmosphere to it. So it was a vibe, but after about 30 minutes of it, you'll really get a sense of what this film has to offer, because it doesn't really do much once you've watched that much.
I can totally see what, like, your frustrations with it. I think I mirror those frustrations, but just to a far lesser extent. But definitely the dialogue is my biggest pet peeve with the whole thing, because it feels like it's shooting for meaning, but like extrapolating or feigning way more depth than it actually offers.
Yeah.
So incorporating nihilism and existential conversations in and around addiction and in and around vampirism makes perfect sense, really, because it's all about what does it mean to be human and to exist, and what is the purpose of life, and people getting the utmost pleasure out of one thing until it destroys them. From a nihilist perspective, could that be considered like a worthy or like a valid way of living and stuff like that? But the thing is, it just kind of constantly rambles and rants at you in quite impenetrable ways, where it's saying loads of things at you at a million miles an hour, and if you haven't read the fucking bibliography, or
you haven't recently tucked into some niche,
exactly, if you're not clued in on any of this philosophical chat, it doesn't really do anything to ingratiate the viewer into understanding exactly what it's saying. And it comes to a point where you kind of get the impression they're not really saying anything, or at least anything new. They're just kind of reiterating points, but with more veiled, flowery language.
I just think the film has to do more than just point out that vampirism is kind of like addiction.
Yeah, that's quite thin.
Beyond that, the film was just kind of offering up lots of flowery language that felt very, like surface level. Because the worst part of this film for me is that I've seen this exact film concept done well. It's called Thirst by Park Chan-wook. It's a very fucking good vampire film, and it's got all the same themes. It's all about addiction. It's all about religion, which this film also touches on quite a lot. And it's also about sex. And it does all of those things in a much more satisfying way, presents it way more interestingly. It's granted, maybe it's just more my wheelhouse because it's a Korean film, so it's obviously got like quite over the top violence in it, which but it really like delivers on that. Like, there are some scenes in that film like, wow, fucking hell. When this film climaxes with its most sort of classic horror movie moment, or when it does have a scene that is particularly violent, there's only really one standout part where she breaks someone's arm, where I was like, oh yeah, no, this is, I guess, a horror film, because the film isn't really scary as much as it is just kind of dour.
Yeah, like dark and arty and
I love miserable
somber
films, like, but this is just like,
it definitely fails to be scary. I wonder if it's even attempting it, to be honest.
I don't think it is.
Which is fine. It doesn't have to be. But it does have its horror scenes, and sometimes they come off quite goofy. There's one moment where she is sort of collapsing on a street after her interaction with Christopher Walken, and she's like helped by a passerby who like picks her up and just like starts carrying her off, and then she immediately bites him in the neck, and then the role reversal happens, and she's like, leaving him dead on the street. It's this tripod shot that just kind of follows them, and it's something about the framing of it and the timing of it is just also like comical. In what feels like quite an unintentional way.
I guess the other thing I'd say is a lot of the things, the way the characters are related to each other. So the problem I have with like really philosophical, overly philosophical, I should say, dialogue, is that a character stops feeling like a character when a character becomes purely a conduit for the writer or the director to just talk to the audience. Yeah. Because at that point you may as well be fourth wall breaking. This may as well be poetry. Yeah. Because the point of a character is to like be a character, right? To have their own motivations. And I guess you could justify this artistically multiple ways. Maybe I'm completely wrong, but it's not just the one character. It's like everyone. So then when you have the scenes with Christopher Walken and they're like talking to each other in this like philosophical debate, it feels so like incidental, especially like the way he comes in and they're just like, oh, and now they're just like talking about philosophy in an apartment.
The entire world's a graveyard, and we, the birds of prey, picking at the bones. You think Nietzsche understood something? Mankind has striven to exist beyond good and evil from the beginning. Have you read Naked Lunch? Burroughs perfectly describes what it's like to go without a fix. Pain's something else. Pain is something we all know, but it takes a special person to see pain. Read the books. Sartre, Beckett. Who do you think they're talking about? You think their works of fiction? I felt the wind of the wings of madness. Baudelaire.
Yeah.
and they're just like talking at each other, and then you just kind of feel like you know it's like there's this like roundabout that's just like swinging, and you're just like, oh, where do I get on? It's I feel like almost I also, because the two characters, I'm like, why are they even doing this? Doesn't really make sense. Why would these characters be doing this, and why am I watching?
And why are they even two separate characters
exactly,
at that point? Because they function in the exact same way, except for maybe Christopher Walken is more of the character insert. It's in some way, it's like, here's my unrefined philosophical perspective on the situation I'm writing about through our protagonist, and then in comes Christopher Walken, who's like, actually I'm Abel Ferrara from the future, and I have a greater understanding of the philosophical concept you are trying to get across, and I'm going to belittle you and berate you for it, but ultimately say the same thing, just in a slightly slicker way, and in an even more veiled and completely impenetrable way. Coming back to the visuals of the film, I think that's probably the thing I would praise the most. I mean, black and white vampire coming of age film, we have to kind of draw some parallels to A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, given that we watched it so recently. In terms of story and like what's underpinning it, it's very different. Similar, but also completely different. But I think it's interesting. On paper, you might describe them as similar, but when you watch them, it's completely different. I think it's interesting to look at what one does right and what one does wrong. And I think both nail the kind of the aesthetic. One is far more slick and beautiful, and this is far more scuzzy and dirty, which obviously evokes the 90s New York.
It's appropriate for what the film's going for.
And I kind of like the, here's one very like sort of beautiful sort of romantic version, and then here's the like the dark, evil, scuzzy, like you're gonna die version. I think it's also interesting how both films chose to have very veiled and kind of undefined narratives throughout, in that it's just kind of things happen in an order, and then by the end you get some semblance of closure, but there's been like very minimal amounts of actual storyline happening throughout.
Well, what I'd say about A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night,
it's a hard one to say.
It is. What I'd say about that is, like this film, it's much more style over substance, but to me it's much more evocative. So what this film, The Addiction, has going for it is a strong sort of visual sense, pretty good like mise en scène, if you want to get pretentious. It's like everything's like, it feels quite real until the characters start talking. That must be a clash that Abel Ferrara anticipated, because you have this like really grimy, it's also got like a strange like aspect ratio, maybe the one I watched, it's like a little bit boxy. I'm not sure what one it's called. It's not like Lighthouse Square, but it's like a little bit more claustrophobic, and it feels very real. And then the people start talking, and it's like, okay, so all of my sense of reality is now gone. And it's very strange as well, because like there's scenes where you have like lots of stuff going on in the background with like loads of characters, like when she goes into this diner and there's like all these people in the background talking, and it all seems like very realistic and like quite well coordinated to seem realistic. And then you go to the next scene where she's talking to her friend outside of university. It immediately becomes like the characters are just once again
it goes from
other.
art film into student film.
Every philosopher had a predecessor without whom his system of philosophy could have never developed. And the same could be said for all of us, but you see, it's all failed because our predecessor doesn't have a name. Our predecessor to what? I don't know what you're talking about.
Yes, exactly.
I think that's the kind of the differentiation you would have, is that this film teeters, for my money at least, on the edge of profundity, but and ends up being actually quite basic and like uninteresting, in that it has the edginess, the correct aesthetic, and visual appeal of a kind of a low budget scuzzy DIY kind of film that you would get from like an art student. And I think it's interesting also that they posits it in the middle of a university campus, because it's almost like you're watching the person as a protagonist that would have made this film.
Well, also, as I'm saying, like this film, like the best thing it does is it's like a very unique feeling film. But then so was A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, and what I also got with that film was it was a much more sort of classic narrative, even if it was sort of subversive in its own ways. But I felt the progression of the story. I understood the characters' motivations, and they felt like characters. And then even if there were elements of the film that I didn't like, by the time the film was over, I was like, okay, I got that. Whereas with this film, it just felt like a dirge.
Right.
And it's hard for me to put it past the fact that this film may well just be too deep for me, and maybe I'm underrating it, because I know a lot of people really rate this film, but it just didn't speak to me. And I generally have, I would say, a pretty high tolerance for pretentious bullshit. And, you know, because I like a lot of pretentious bullshit. Like, you even compare this to something like The Lighthouse, right? It just purely aesthetically.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, The Lighthouse not only does it better aesthetically, it also has the story, right? But that film is like so immediately memorable. It's got like structure to it. This film, like, sure, it does it. So it's not offering you like a complex narrative, but it's also not offering you like characters like a Richard Linklater coming of age film might. It's not really offering much in the way of style beyond like this kind of gritty aesthetic. It's not offering you a storyline, and it also isn't scary. All it really has to offer is the dialogue, which I found pretty grating.
And it's sort of its visual style,
Yes.
as we've said.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to argue when you put it in those terms, but I do think there is a certain kind of charm and value to it. I think it's not so much. I think it's interesting what you said, like maybe the film's too deep for you. I don't think that necessarily matters, because if a film has a high concept and does a poor job of conveying it to its audience and is deliberately kind of obscure for the sake of, I guess, gatekeeping its audience in a strange way, that's pretentious in of itself. Like if you have a grand message to convey, like a something truly profound that you think that the world should know about it, but you veil it in such a way as that even sort of hardened moviegoers who have a high tolerance for this kind of dialogue and this kind of atmosphere can't break into it, then you've created something that is flawed. You've created an impenetrable piece of art that I shouldn't have to study for the films I watch. The film, I mean, sure, I might need to educate myself further on a film, but if I'm completely lost, then that's a completely different argument.
Yeah, I just think beyond everything I've said, I just don't think the film makes that interesting of a commentary on vampirism as addiction commentary. It's very on the nose with it, and it's very immediate. You can tell from the title that that's what it's going to be about.
Yeah,
like,
I think that is a bit...
And honestly, I feel like you can kind of, if you watch like a little bit of the film and look at the poster, read the synopsis, you've pretty much got the feeling of this film. And there are films like very similar to this with very similar themes that do much more interesting things. So
yeah,
it's not bad. Like, it's not like really, really bad. It's just because there's just an element of professionalism and an element of intention and purposefulness to it that a lot of other films, like, clearly there's like been a lot of care and attention put into this film. I think maybe just conceptually I just don't like it.
It was just lacking.
Yeah.
I will say I think the film has like quite a good climax. I really like how it builds where you think throughout the film she's just been killing off all these characters in admittedly repetitive scenes, but quite sort of stylish. And then they all come together at this sort of grand party she's throwing, where she's like killing all of the sort of high ups and like her fellow like classmates and stuff like from her college, which I think is interesting in of itself. Now that I think about it, is that in some way a commentary on the nihilistic perspective, or is it like is Abel Ferrara turning around to us and saying all of this pseudo profound nonsense I've been spewing at you is actually just a big sort of in joke, and I couldn't give a fuck about philosophy, here's all of the philosophers dying.
Philosophy is propaganda. There is always an attempt to influence the object, to change its view of things. The real question is, what is the philosopher's impact on other egos, transcendent or otherwise?
Does that lie within the grammar of your thesis?
If we eliminate the verb, we eliminate meaning. The predicate defines the noun's role in being. That's why my analysis insisted on a discernible didacticism in the works of the philosopher. It belies his transcendence, his independence.
And the result?
Essence is revealed through praxis.
I would like it if that was true. I didn't get that sense from it. I thought it was probably the most entertaining part.
Yeah, because
this isn't a film that's aiming to be entertaining.
No, it's not. But that, you know, there's a lot of violence, a lot of blood, just quite satisfying, gruesome happenings, you know. And for a film often lacking in its sense of horror, whilst not scary, it is kind of alarming in just how like vicious it is towards the victims. And then there's a kind of, then from there the ending is a little trite.
Well, again, I'm gonna just draw a comparison to another film. I saw what the film was going to do with the hospital bed ending bit, where she's in the bed and she asks the nurse to open the curtains. Obviously, we presume she's a vampire, she's going to die. And I was almost enjoying the tension of that scene just a little bit, because it was making me think about Let the Right One In, which has a very similar scene with a very different outcome that is just so visually iconic to that film. It's like one of the classic, you know, foreign horror films that people have seen that's actually somewhat popular. And it just made me think of that scene. I was like, wow, that was a great scene. And then I kind of realised that I was only really enjoying the scene because I was thinking
because of the parallel it was drawing in your mind. Right, well, I think we have called Abel Ferrara pretentious git long enough.
What would you rate it?
I think I would rate it a 6 out of 10.
Wow, okay. It is, you know, it's a subjective thing.
Before I knew how negative your opinions of it were, I had something of a higher estimation. But like I said at the beginning, it did kind of baffle me. Like the film, its confusing nature and its sort of hypnotic repetition, it's hard to get your head around. And so I finished the film feeling kind of conflicted and confused about how I felt. And I think, you know, artfully there is something here, but I just don't think it's explored in an entertaining way and in the most emotive and like thought-provoking way, in spite of its very best attempts to be as like thought-provoking as possible.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think this film like definitely has something to say, and I could even recommend this to people if, you know, if I knew someone where I could gauge their kind of tolerance for this kind of thing. I do think there's something of value to this film, at least just aesthetically, because it does have, as I said, like a very unique visual atmosphere to it, and I think the acting is generally good in the film, apart from maybe Christopher Walken, but I don't know.
No!
It's hard to tell, to be honest. But yeah, overall I just didn't enjoy the film. I don't think it had much to say, despite saying a lot. I don't think the aesthetic of it was enough to win me over, and it just kind of left me feeling annoyed and confused. So 4 out of 10
Fair enough
from me.
Yeah.
But yeah, this has been the Hooptober review from Internally Screening of The Addiction. If you like this video, like the video. If you dislike the video, dislike the video. If you want to see more video, subscribe. And I've been Rupert.
And I've been Adam.
And peace out, bitches.
Peace. Hit that vape.
I've got to hit that vape. It was stressing me out thinking about vampires.